Hello and welcome to tutorial number 9. In this tutorial we'll be talking about the skeletal anatomy of the head. We will first begin with the lateral view of the head, the view from the side. We will begin with from the bottom portion and we'll go up. So down here you have the lower jaw. This whole area here is the lower jaw, and it is also called the mandible. It consists of a ramus you can call it, to which is the site of masseter muscle attachment. We'll talk about muscles later. So the ramus, then here is a structure called condyloid process of the mandible. The condyle process. It articulates with the rest of the skull, with the upper portion, with the skull. Mandible is not really part of the skull. It's the lower jaw. So it articulates with the skull. And then there's another process there, which you can't see fully. It goes under this bone. That is called the coronoid process of the mandible, and that is site of attachment of masseter muscle. Temporalis muscle, sorry. So condyloid process, ramus, and coronoid process. And this you can just call a sigmoid notch. Sigmoid notch. Then there's an opening here, that's called the mental foramen. And the blood vessels and nerves come out through that. Okay, so that's the mandible. Next we will look at the skull. So we will begin with this prominent structure here. This is called the zygomatic arch, because from top view it looks like an arch. We will see that later. So the zygomatic arch here, this portion of it is called the zygomatic bone. So the zygomatic bone, zygomatic arch. Okay, this opening here, this is called the external auditory meatus. It leads into the ear, into the middle ear, and into the inner ear. So the external auditory meatus. Then here we have like a structure like this, like a little stick. It's called the styloid process. Also site of muscle attachments, particularly muscles, for example, that go to the throat. And here is another bone. It's called the mastoid bone. You can feel this bone. It's right behind your ear. The mastoid bone, external auditory meatus, and styloid process. Zygomatic arch, zygomatic bone. Okay, and that portion there where the condyloid process of the mandible articulates with the skull is called the mandibular fossa. You can say mandibular fossa because that's where the mandible articulates with that portion of the skull. Next we will look at this front portion of the face. So before that you can see a little bone here. That is your nasal bone. That's the very first portion of your nose, and it's made of bone. The rest is all cartilage, hyaline cartilage. And that little portion that sticks up, that's the nasal spine. It forms the bottom portion of your nose. And all of this area here, not the zygomatic bone, but everything here, is called the maxilla. Maxilla forms most of your face. Okay, that's that. There are two openings here. One is in the maxilla, just below the eye. It's called infraorbital foramen. The other one is it's not shown here, but there's an opening in the zygomatic bone. That's called the zygomaticofacial foramen. And also there's an opening just above the eye. That's called the supraorbital foramen. Sometimes it's attached to the orbit, so it's called the supraorbital notch. Here we have a large bone here, which part of this whole area of the ear, you can see it's also occupies the mastoid bone within it. It's called the squamosal, not this, here. The squamosal bone. Okay, that's part of the temporal region. This whole side is called the temporal region. All of this is your side, the temporal region. Like when you say my temples, the temporal region. Then you have little bone here. That's called the great wing of sphenoid. It continues inside of the orbit, forming the orbital wing of sphenoid. The great wing of sphenoid, and then inside the eye, orbital wing of sphenoid. Here is a bone forming the forehead. It is called the frontal bone. Then parietal bone, most of the head. Parietal bone. And finally at the back, occipital bone. The line here is called the coronal suture, and this line here is called the lambdoid suture. Lambdoid, if you look for the spelling, lambdoid suture. Coronal suture, lambdoid suture. along the midline of the head runs another suture, so you can't see it. If you look from the top, along the midline there is a line, another suture running all the way back. That is called the sagittal suture. The point at which the coronal suture intersects the sagittal suture is called the bregma. Bregma, B-R-E, bregma, B-R-E-G-M-A. And the point at which the lambdoid suture intersects the sagittal suture, it's called the lambda. Lambdoid suture, sagittal suture, lambda, coronal suture, sagittal suture, bregma. Okay, squamosal, occipital, frontal, parietal, squamosal, great wing of sphenoid, and then inside the orbital wing of sphenoid, zygomatic bone, zygomatic arch, external artery medius, styloid process, this here, mastoid bone, ramus of the mandible, the whole thing is a mandible, condyloid process, coronoid process, and maxilla here, infraorbital foramen, supraorbital foramen or notch, zygomaticofacial foramen, nasal bone, nasal spine.